Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Sharing Our Water. Essentially, I'm going to argue that water is a shared global to local resource. It's a global resource because water is circulating all the time, because it's affected, for example, by global trade and climate change, and because local challenges can add up to global trends. For example, water scarcity can become a huge problem when perceived at a global level because it affects so many people worldwide. So, water circulates from vapor to rain through snow. Water moves. Therefore, governance of water must involve the governance of atmospheric water called rainbow water, ice water, blue water like in rivers or groundwater, green water, the water in trees and plants, grey wastewater, and even perhaps salt water in oceans. And essentially, we also are governing the water that is embodied in the food that we export to other countries, and that's called virtual water trade. And of course, if you really want to govern water well, you have to govern all the sectors that influence water. So agriculture or forestry, but you also have to look at water-related infrastructure, and you have to look at climate change, which has an impact on water. This presentation has basically three components. The first component or argument is that water supply is essentially less than demand in many parts of the world, therefore leading to scarcity. This scarcity is currently governed through piecemeal approaches or what is called fragmented governance. But if such fragmented governance is inevitable on a long-term basis, perhaps we need to have constitutionalization or the rule of law. So, in general terms, one could argue that fresh water is more or less limited, but demand keeps increasing because the population rises, consumption patterns change, and there's global trade in water-related products. And so this means that on a per capita basis, water is less and less available. This means that you have to share water between different sectors, for example, between the agricultural sector and the ecosystem sector, between people. For example, indigenous people might be living on a piece of land where mines are now coming in and want to use their land and water. Between countries, for example, countries along the Indus, the Nile or the Mekong. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's virtual water trade. Now, in general, this scarcity is being managed through a piecemeal approach, through fragmentation. Let me now first briefly tell you a little bit about the context of water governance. If you take on the y-axis the spatial scale from local to global, and on the x-axis a time scale, then you find that rules on water governance started with the early civilizations, the Indus Valley, the Chinese, the Mesopotamian, and it moved around. Then with the spread of religions, it moved to different parts of the world. Then through conquest, colonization, ideologies like communism, the spread of science in the recent centuries, and then environmentalism and globalization. And what you find essentially in this process is that you have multiple rules operating simultaneously. So, essentially you have a country with perhaps local rules and actors, and then you get provincial rules and actors being superimposed, markets and NGOs coming up with their ideas about how water should be governed, national rules and actors, regional governance and actors, and then you have a whole bunch of actors at the global level also trying to govern this particular resource. And this basically leads to multiple or plural perspectives, plural approaches, multiple rules on the same people and the same types of areas or actors. And this can create confusion, but it can also be positive in many ways. So, why does this all add up? It adds up because what I'm trying to say is when you make new rules, you're imposing those new rules on existing systems of rules and rights and responsibilities. So it's not a clean slate on which you begin. So if I go back to my earlier point that water circulates, it's very clear, it's very difficult to come up with an appropriate definition of the water body you want to govern, and therefore there are boundary issues involved. Also, everybody has a different perspective. Some people believe in the human right to water. Some people believe that water is a gift of God. Others think that this is a heritage of mankind or humankind. And still others say, no, water is an economic good and should be priced. And then, of course, you have scholars who come up with a range of approaches to deal with water. So you have people who say we must govern all water-related issues from the perspective of water. That's called integrated water resource management. Others say, no, we need to look at all the different sectors that deal with water and try and come up with a nexus approach. And still others say we need to look at water from the perspective of human security, national security, and planetary boundaries. Depending on your approach and your paradigms, you'll come up with different rules regarding the uses, the users, and the drivers of problems in relation to water. You'll also have a different toolbox. But all these ideas have to take into account that through the last 5,000 years of water history, people already have acquired ownership rights, access rights, and much of this is already organized in customary systems. And very often, intellectuals and scholars think that they can just start afresh and redistribute. It's not so straightforward. So when you have water scarcity, and given that water scarcity is going to become worse and worse in the future with the impacts of climate change, but also with growing population demand and economic growth, there are four options. The first option is the neoliberal capitalist option. You create markets for water, you commodify water, you privatize it, you trade it. Very often this happens through confidential contracts which are highly secretive. Or you could have hegemonic power. Hegemonic power is when countries use sovereignty and securitization arguments to control the water that they have within their boundaries. A third option is having polycentric water governance. In polycentric governance, there are multiple actors and everyone is doing their own thing. Finally, you have sustainable development governance, which is sort of transformative. It's universal and intergovernmental, and it's basically trying to come up with a global constitution and rule of law within which all the others could perhaps function. Now, the neoliberal capitalist approach is fine in most cases, except that it empowers the rich, because only the rich can perhaps afford to buy water at different prices. Also, it shrouds water governance in secrecy because the contracts are all secretive. In general, these options all lead to a certain amount of global incoherence, because if you have multiple discourses, these discourses are not necessarily compatible, because everybody is struggling for control over water. And because if you want multiple people to participate, you'll probably get different outcomes in different places. So fragmentation is inevitable, incoherence is inevitable. I argue here in favor of sustainable development, universal intergovernmentalism, because I think that neoliberal approaches can allocate water, but cannot share it between different users and users. Because hegemonic approaches empower the state that has the most water, and hegemons do not want to share scarce water resources. Because polycentric approaches can solve local governance issues, but cannot solve global sharing of water. This sustainable intergovernmentalism basically focuses on having goals at the global level, perhaps the Sustainable Development Goals. It has a sense of principles on environmental and development related issues. It recognizes human rights, equity, and the right to develop of different countries. It has standards to protect ecosystems. But most of all, it tries to create the rule of law at global level and constitutionalism so that no man, no king, no bank, no country is above the law when it comes to trying to share these water resources between countries. This brings me to my conclusion. Water is increasingly a global governance issue because there are local issues involved, there are global issues involved, and you have to manage them simultaneously. Fresh water is increasingly scarce given the growing demand for this resource. And this demand for resource is being dealt with right now in many fragmented ways, partly by the market, partly by different governance systems, and partly by polycentric governance approaches. I think that is inevitable. We cannot govern water globally in a very comprehensive system. So fragmentation is inevitable. But in order to ensure that everybody has access to drinking water and sanitation, we need some basic rules and constitutionalization at the global level. We also need to ensure that these rules protect our water and its ecosystem services so that water continues to serve us and we can live in harmony with nature. Thank you.